Bioholic once again. I am your educator Ankita. Last day we have learned about the cell theory, and today we will talk about the cell membrane. Now before going to start the video, I want to tell you that after watching the video, if you have any questions or doubts regarding this topic, you can ask me in the comment section below. Okay? So now let's begin. So membrane in biology is a thin layer that forms the outer boundary of a living cell or of an internal cell compartment, and the outer boundary is the plasma membrane, and the compartments enclosed by the internal membranes are called as cell organelles. Now let's see what is the definition of the cell membrane. So the cell membrane of a cell is a network of lipids and proteins, mainly the lipid and proteins, that forms the boundary between the cell's contents and the outside of the cell, or you can say the extracellular fluid. So it is also simply called as the plasma membrane. Now this cell membrane is typically between 4 to 10 nanometers in thickness and surrounds every living cell, delimiting the cell from the environment around it. Okay? Now directly we will go to the structures of cell membrane. So at the very first we will talk about the phospholipids. But before we explore these parts, we need to know some key terms like hydrophobic and hydrophilic. So what are these two terms mean? So what is hydrophobic? So hydrophobic means having an aversion to water, or you can say which is afraid of water, or tending to form droplets in water. So hydrophobic is a term used to describe how molecules react with water. Molecules that are hydrophobic have an aversion to water and are often referred as water fearing or water hating. Okay, now the second one is hydrophilic. So hydrophilic is a term which is used to describe how molecules react with water, and the molecules that are hydrophilic have an affinity for water, so that hydrophilic is often referred as water loving. Okay, so now first and foremost the phospholipids. So what is the phospholipid? So phospholipid is a molecule that is a constituent of the inner bilayer of a biological membrane, having a polar hydrophilic head and a non-polar hydrophobic tail. So a phospholipid molecule is composed of glycerol, a 3-carbon compound with 2 fatty acids joined to 2 carbons and a phosphorylated alcohol molecule. Okay? So it says that the membrane is partially made up of the molecules called phospholipids, which spontaneously arrange themselves into droppable layer with hydrophilic heads on the outside and the hydrophobic tails in the inside. Now these interactions with water are what allow plasma membranes to form. Okay, so next component is the protein, or you can say the membrane protein, which are two kinds. Okay, one is the integral protein and the other one is peripheral protein. So what are the integral proteins? So typically a transmembrane protein with the hydrophobic regions that completely spans the hydrophobic interior of the membrane are known as integral protein. Okay, and these integral proteins in the plasma membrane penetrate the lipid bilayer from one side to another side of the membrane. And these proteins control the entry and exit of specific molecules from the cell. And they also have a hydrophobic and hydrophilic region which helps keep them in place in the membrane. Okay? And the second one is the peripheral proteins. So what are the peripheral proteins? Mainly a protein appendage loosely bound to the surface of a membrane and not embedded in the lipid bilayer. They are known as peripheral protein. Okay? So the protein molecules are not fixed in one spot of the membrane and they actually float in the fluid phospholipid bilayer or are attached to an integral protein. Okay? And these peripheral proteins are also known as glycoproteins. Okay? Because they have a carbohydrate attached. Okay? And the function in the immune responses and are involved in the cell-to-cell recognition. Okay? Now we have learned about two types of protein. Now these proteins are wedged between the lipids that make up the membrane. And these transmembrane proteins allow molecules that could not enter the cell otherwise to pass through the forming channels or pores or gates. Okay? Now in this way the cell controls the flow of these molecules as they enter or exit. Now the proteins in the cell membrane play a role in many functions like cell signaling, cell recognition, enzyme activity and lot more things. Okay? Next is the carbohydrate. Okay, so carbohydrates are also found in the plasma membrane. And specifically, most carbohydrates in the membrane are part of the glycoproteins, which are formed when the carbohydrate attached to a protein. I have already said that. Now the glycoproteins play a very important role in the interactions between the cells, including the cell adhesion. So what is cell adhesion? So cell adhesion is a process by which the cells attach to each other. Okay, so as we are talking about the hydrophilic end and the hydrophobic end, let's make it more clear to you that there is a term called micelles. So what are micelles? So micelles are nothing but lipid molecules that arrange themselves in a spherical form in aqueous solution. Okay? And the formation of a micelle is a response to the amphipathic nature of the fatty acids. So what is the amphipathic nature? Mainly it denotes that they contain both hydrophilic and hydrophobic regions, and it is an alternative lipid conformation. And mainly micelles can form when the lipid amount is low relative to the water ratio, and also they can form a regions of membrane instability. Okay, so next is the very important thing, fluid mosaic model, which was first proposed by Singer and Nicholson in 1972. Okay, and this model describes that the composition of the plasma membrane and how phospholipids, proteins and carbohydrates freely move within it. Okay, and there are two characteristics behind the name of this model. Like the first one is the cell membrane is very flexible, not rigid at all, meaning the phospholipids in each layer can move from each side to another side, and thus the membrane behaves like a fluid, just like the film of the oil on the surface of water. Okay, and the second characteristic is the other molecules in the cell membrane give it a different pattern and textures, just like the tiles in the mosaic. Okay, now this fluid mosaic model gives some idea about the amphipathic properties of the phospholipid molecules. Now you can see the head of the phospholipid is hydrophilic, and the fatty acid tails are hydrophobic. Now the phospholipids are considered as amphipathic molecules due to the fact that they have both hydrophilic and hydrophobic region. And the phospholipid molecules are arranged in a plasma membrane due to the way they react with water. Because the polar heads of the molecules are hydrophilic, they are arranged so that they are always facing the internal and external fluid of the environment of the cell. Okay? And due to the fact that the fatty acids tails are hydrophobic, they face inwards towards each other and away from the fluid environment. Okay? Now the fatty acid tails in the center of the membrane are attracted to each other, and the phosphate heads are attracted to the surrounding of water, and this makes the structure of the plasma membrane very stable. Okay? And there are many different types of membrane proteins. They occupy different positions in the plasma membrane depending upon their structure and function. Okay, so we will talk about it in later. So this was the fluid mosaic model, which is very important. Next, moving on to the functions of cell membrane. So at the very first, physical barrier. So the plasma membrane surrounds all cells and physically separates the cytoplasm, which is the material that makes up the cell, from the extracellular fluid outside of the cell. And this protects all the components of the cell from outside environment and allows separate activities to occur inside and outside of the cell. Now the plasma membrane provides structural support to the cell. It tethers the cytoskeleton. So what is cytoskeleton? So the cytoskeleton is a network of the protein filaments inside the cell that hold all the parts of the cell in a place. And this gives the cell its own shape. Now certain organisms such as the plants and fungi have a cell wall in addition to the membrane, but the cell wall is composed of the molecules such as cellulose. Now it also provides some additional support of the cell, and it is why the plant cells do not burst like animal cells do if too much water diffuses into them. Next function is the selective permeability of the cell membrane. So plasma membranes are selectively permeable, or you can say semi-permeable, meaning that only certain molecules can pass through them. Like water, oxygen and carbon dioxide can easily travel throughout the membrane. And generally, ions like the sodium or potassium and polar molecules cannot pass through the membrane. They must go through the specific channels or pores in the membrane instead of freely diffusing through, just like the water or oxygen. And this is why the membrane can control the rate at which certain molecules can enter or exit the cell. Okay. Next is the endocytosis and exocytosis. So what is endocytosis? So endocytosis is basically when a cell ingests relatively larger contents than the single ions or molecules that pass through the channels. And exocytosis is when the cell releases those materials. Okay. Now the shape of the membrane itself changes to allow the molecules to enter or exit the cell. It also forms vacuoles, some bubbles of membrane that can transport many molecules at once, and in order to transport the materials to different places in the cell. Okay. And last function is the cell signaling. So another important function of the membrane is to facilitate the communication and signaling between cells. It does so through the use of various proteins and carbohydrates in the membrane. Okay, the proteins on the cell mark the cell so that other cells can identify it. And the membrane also has receptors that allow it to carry out certain tasks when the molecules such as hormones or ligand bind to those receptors. Okay. Now after all these things, if you have any questions or any doubts regarding today's lecture, then you can ask me in the comment section below. And if you find this video helpful, then give it a big thumbs up. It means a lot for us. And if you are new here, then please subscribe to our channel, hit the bell icon, share the video, and you will get the notifications of our upcoming videos. And that's all for today. Thanks for watching. Take care and keep watching Bioholic.